Newspaper comics have been an unusually common source material for musical theater. One of the very first newspaper comics, Winsor McCay's Little Nemo, was turned into an operetta as early as 1908 and remade as an operetta as recently as 2012. Comics present a uniquely and quietly powerful intellectual property. While the debate continues about whether or not newspaper comics can be considered high art, though in a post-Calvin and Hobbes world I would say that debate is closing down, newspaper comics are widely circulated and recognized by a large percentage of Americans. Thus, like any good intellectual property, it seems reasonable that over time they would become musical theater. Other musicals that are based on comic strips include You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, Lil Abner, The Addams Family, and most famously of all, What's notable about all of these examples is that the comics they were adapting are not really in the running for the question of whether or not a comic strip can be considered high art. All of the comics being adapted were considered general entertainment. Being turned into a musical comedy was the next logical step, and it didn't dilute the form at all. What would be interesting, though, is if any of those comics being adapted were trying to be something more, trying to be Pulitzer-worthy political satire. This is the case we find ourselves in with 1983's musical adaptation of Doonesbury.
Well, the strip has always been known primarily for politics, and it got that reputation early on. When the strip first broke, it was the only place on the comics page where politics and other edgier material, the Vietnam War, sex, drugs, rock and roll, were discussed.
I mean, look at our mores now. How long has it been since any of us has been into organic gardening, or macrame, or even group sex?
However, I think what really drew readers and brought them back and has held on to a number of them through the years has been the characters, and that's what sets this book apart, is that focus.
But there's actually two things that set Doonesbury apart from its contemporaries in the musical based on a comic strip genre. The first is obviously the source material and its tone, but the second is who wrote the musical adaptation. Compare Charles Schulz, whose Peanuts got a musical adaptation 16 years after its launch. Schulz did no work on his musical, simply licensing the comics to Clark M. Gessner, who wrote the entire musical. Doonesbury, on the other hand, which had a musical adaptation 12 years after its premiere, was written by its writer, Gary Trudeau, who actually took a 22-month hiatus from writing the comic to create a musical adaptation of it. Which begs the question, why?
I wouldn't want to hold you to words of way back when, but now is not so very far from there. Stop in the middle of your life for asking who came of age with youthful rage at me like. Stop.
Gary Trudeau did not set out to become a newspaper comic, and he certainly didn't set out to write the same comic for nearly 50 years. Trudeau went to Yale to study painting, but it was while he was there that he discovered that he was more interested in the graphic arts. He began cartooning for the Yale Daily News, creating a comic called Bull Tales. Bull Tales was a direct satire of things that happened at Yale, specifically of Yale quarterback Brian Dowling. The action of Bull Tales was centered in the sort of juvenile humor that you'd expect on a college campus, and the life of Brian Dowling and what he did in his games and in his personal life was directly implanted into the character. Of course, the character was not named Brian Dowling, the character was given his initials, BD. This was a simple comic that Trudeau wrote to pass the time. It was not something that he intended to continue after he graduated college. However, before Trudeau could graduate, his comic strip caught the attention of two publishers, Jim Andrews and John McNeill. The two were looking to form their own press syndicate, and they reached out to Trudeau to ask him if he'd be willing to have Bull Tales as their very first syndicated comic strip. Trudeau agreed, retitled the comic, and it premiered on October 26th of 1970. United Press Syndicate, which would later be renamed to Andrews-McNeill Syndicate, would later gain a foothold as one of the major publishers of comic strips, with a couple other comics that you might have heard of. But Doonesbury, which the comic was now retitled, was the very first one. The word Doonesbury comes from a combination of two different words, the word Doon, meaning idiot, according to Trudeau, and Pillsbury, the last name of Trudeau's college roommate. While Doonesbury was certainly very successful in the 1970s in ways that we'll get to in a second, It has really become a cultural mainstay over the last half-century. Trudeau continues to write the comic to this day, and the cast has grown massive and unwieldy. There are over 100 characters who have names and backstories and plot points that people actually follow. So for today, for this video, I want to focus on just the ones that existed in 1983 when the musical came out, because they're the ones that matter to this story. Most of the characters in 1983 especially still fit into the basic tropes of collegiate humor that you saw in Bull Tales. BD remains as the jock, Mike Doonesbury is the writer and the audience surrogate character, Mark is the well-meaning liberal who is fighting for whatever cause he can get his hands around, Zonker is the hippie, Joni Caucus, the second-wave feminist house mom who comes to live with the college students, who is literally named after the Women's Democratic Caucus, Ginny, the black activist, Scott Sloan, the reverend, Boopsie, the blonde, and Roland Headley, the reporter. While Trudeau was quick to distance Doonesbury from Bull Tales by making the comic more about the world around the college than the antics at the college itself, by the mid-1970s that had shifted into direct political satire. The commentary had always been there, even in the earlier years of the strip, and honestly, most of the stuff from the first 4 years still holds bite in our modern political era. But the comic that made Doonesbury from a niche success into a national success was this comic, published in 1975 and based on the ongoing Watergate scandal. This was also the year that Trudeau became the first comic strip to win the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning. Suddenly, Doonesbury was a national phenomenon. It was featured on the cover of Time, and people were reading it to get information about the Watergate scandal, which continued to break throughout the comic's first couple of years. In fact, later in 1975, President Gerald Ford famously told the press at the Radio Television Correspondents' Dinner, "There are only 3 major vehicles to keep us informed as to what is going on in Washington: the electronic media, the print media, and Doonesbury," not necessarily in that order. And now that Trudeau has more than 4 decades of comics in the books for Doonesbury, the comic strip continues to retain its satirical bite. He has, after his '75 win for the Pulitzer, been shortlisted again in 1990, 2004, and 2005. Like all art that matters, Doonesbury's place on the political edge has struck people the wrong way at times. It's notable that it has its own Wikipedia entry for Doonesbury controversies. The introduction of Zonker's Uncle Duke in December 1974, and his envoy Honey Huan in January '76, both frequently involved in real-life political events, including meeting in China in 1976, marked a distinct turning point. Adding to the Dragon's hoard of accolades achieved by Doonesbury, in 1977, Trudeau produced a Doonesbury special, a 26-minute short film that basically summed up everything that was going on in the comic at that point. It contains all the major characters, it has discussions about policy.
I do believe, yes, I do believe, a day will come when all of mankind will take the time to understand.
It has a lot of the best bits that ultimately don't make it into the musical, like Joni Caucus's really woke group of kindergartners.
So I switched from tennis to anthropology. I'm very into Margaret Mead right now.
Margaret Mead.
I like to study sex in the Caribbean. Can I study sex in the Caribbean?
And in general, it serves as a zeitgeist for what it was like to live at that time. Doonesbury is rightly regarded for the way that it satirizes the politics of whatever time period it's in, but Doonesbury's real secret is that it's about what it's like to actually live during those times. It's about the day-to-day, the way that the political always has to invade the personal.
Look, why don't you just cast me as a Nubian slave?
In this day and age?
All right, a Nubian waiter.
A Doonesbury special later went on to win a special jury prize at the Cannes Film Festival and was later nominated for Best Animated Short Film at the 50th Academy Awards. And then with the introduction in September 1979 of Joni's abandoned daughter JJ, we have all the major players we need to put together a musical of Doonesbury. It's worth noting that all the characters mentioned up to this point show up in the Doonesbury musical with 2 exceptions, Reverend Scott Sloan and Ginny. Part of the reason for this is that they don't live at Walden Commune with the others, so it didn't make sense to include them. But this also means that Honey is the only person of color in this entire musical. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There is a musical.
The entire Doonesbury gang has moved from Walden to Broadway. And everything is falling into place. There's drama, romance, excitement, and sensitivity.
We're talking human garbage.
Prior to 1983, Doonesbury existed on a floating timeline. Things certainly happened. JJ and Mike began an on-again, off-again romance. Joni got married and had a son. Zonker was, well, it was still Zonker. But the point was, nobody aged significantly. The kids remained in college, reacting to whatever was actually happening in the real world, but there was no eventual graduation to be led to.
Doonesbury, the musical, has come of age at the Biltmore Theater. They're finally graduating.
For $40,000, they have to give you a diploma.
By the early 80s, Trudeau wanted to end that and exist on a literal timeline in which the characters would age as the comic continued. And he wanted a big, impactful way of doing that. So what he did was, he stopped the comic. On January 2nd, 1983, just after the in-comic birth of Joni's son Jeff, who would later grow up in the 1980s and 90s, Doonesbury went on hiatus. Trudeau began planning a musical of Doonesbury in which the graduation of the characters from college would be the final moment of the play. From then on, 1983 would be their graduation year, and the characters would age, get jobs, get married, and have kids in real time. Trudeau, however, was only planning on writing the book and lyrics for this musical. For the music itself, he went with Elizabeth Swados.
I always have a lot going on. I always do more than like 3 things.
I mean, 3 novels?
Yes, 3 novels.
3 novels, okay. At least 2 nonfiction books.
4.
4.
Swados is probably one of the most prolific musical theater composers to never achieve mainstream success, although she had a lot of success off-Broadway and underground. Like Trudeau, she had also started writing in 1970 with frequent collaborations with La Mama Experimental Theater, the 2018 Regional Theater Tony winner. Swados' work up to that point was mostly writing the music for straight plays to accompany in the background, but she did have a couple of musical credits to her name. Most notably, in 1978, she wrote and directed a sleeper hit on Broadway called Runaways.
Tell me, where do they go? And where do they stay if they stay? Baby's running from mama. Mama. Baby is a runaway. Runaway.
It was due to this project that Swados and Trudeau eventually knew each other and met. Although there are obvious parallels in the timeline of their careers, Swados' writing was a natural fit to Doonesbury in subject matter as well. Although Trudeau had gained more mainstream success, much of Swados' work was making the same leftist talking points that he was.
What have they done with their million? They spent a lot on yoga, Freud, and Zen, and they saved enough, yeah, they saved enough.
In Trudeau's mind, Swados was the perfect writer to represent the dissonant sound of the counterculture. Swados was also not afraid to put very serious topics to music. She dealt with issues from homelessness to infidelity to, eventually, depression. It's notable that 2 decades after Doonesbury, she also would write a children's book, My Depression, which would later become a film which she would write more songs for.
Oh no, here's that cloud. What the hell is that little cloud?
And honestly, to put in a side note here, because I'm not going to go back and talk about it later in the video, Swados unfortunately passed away in 2016, and her work is generally under-recorded and underrepresented. There was a Encore's off-center production of Runaways in 2016, which is where this footage comes from, but besides that, I think that she's an artist people should learn more about. I think it would certainly behoove La Mama to dredge up a lot of the music that she wrote for them and get a recording of it out. She is a lost talent of Broadway that I think needs to be remembered. But in addition to all of these stylistic similarities, Swados was also a good composer, so she agreed to work on the musical with Trudeau. And like with Happy Days in the previous episode, there's not a lot to talk about with the process with this one. Don't worry, in later videos we will actually be talking about musicals that had troubled rehearsal processes. We will return to that, it's just that these 2 episodes don't have that. With relatively little trouble, Doonesbury opened on Broadway at the Biltmore Theater on November 21st, 1983. The show received mixed reviews from critics. People generally liked it, they thought that Swados' music was good and they praised a lot of the performances from the actors, but people were concerned that the satirical bite from the original Doonesbury comic strip had been lost in translation. There was more about the personal than the political in this musical, in a comic strip that usually melded the 2 very well. Then again, after a 4-month run on Broadway, Doonesbury's script was actually published by Samuel French, so we can look at it to corroborate all these criticisms, so let's dig in. The plot of the Doonesbury musical deals with multiple threads across the 10 ensemble characters. Mike wants to propose to JJ but can't act impulsively, which is taken directly from the comics. Zonker doesn't want to leave Walden Commune because he wants to remain a student forever and professionally tan, which comes from the comics. Mark is trying to turn his job as a college radio host into something approximating a real job, again, comics. BD has been drafted by the Dallas Cowboys, and Boopsie plans to become a Dallas Cowgirl to join him in Texas. The Boopsie as cheerleader to BD dynamic comes from the comics. Roland Headley is reporting on what students are doing at college these days, early in the comics. Joni and JJ are coming to terms with Joni's decision to run away from JJ's father, abandoning her daughter. This is alluded to in the comic, but the musical is actually the first time that we see this conflict really play out. It would play out more in the later 80s and 90s. Duke is on trial for smuggling 10 kilos of cocaine into the United States. This is not from the comic, but it is very on brand for him. The role of Duke was played in the original production by Gary Beach, who passed away earlier this year. He is best known now for playing Lumiere in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, and Roger Debris in both the musical and film remake of The Producers.
To heil myself, raise your beer, every hotsy-totsy Nazi stand and cheer.
Honey was played by Lauren Tom, who is best recognizable now for her voice acting work on King of the Hill and Amy Wong on Futurama.
Don't tell me to shut up. You know what happened to the last guy who told me to shut up?
And yes, she was also on Friends.
Everyone, this is Julie.
Oh.
Hi.
Unlike Charlie Brown, which took dialogue and entire scenes directly out of the comics, all of the dialogue for the Doonesbury musical was completely new. Even the conflicts, which again came from newspaper comics, were rewritten for this musical. One of the criticisms of the musical when it opened was the relative dearth of genuine political commentary in it. There were allusions to things that were happening socially.
Was Woodstock merely rural? Was Vietnam just intramural?
But the musical stayed pretty resolutely focused on its characters and the plot of getting ready for graduation. There was one major exception to this, though. In the comics, shots of the White House have always been used to allow the current occupant of that house to be satirized without being seen. In the musical, they had a drop curtain with a drawing of the White House on it, and they played conversations between Reagan and his aides, obviously staged, via audio when that drop was down during the transitions. Trudeau was actually on hand for most of the Broadway run writing new political sketches as new information came out about the politics of 1983. The actual plot of the musical, such as there is one, deals with the characters overcoming all those individual crises mentioned before graduation. The one thread running through it is what will happen to the building they're in, Walden Commune. Walden Commune was the central location for Doonesbury in the first 12 years of its run, with a good portion of the comics taking place there. It served as a sort of home base for the characters, the way that The Wall does in Peanuts, or the Treehouse does in Calvin and Hobbes. But with the characters about to graduate college, and the musical is literally set on the day before and the day of graduation, it was necessary for Trudeau to move them out of Walden Commune if they wanted to move into the real world. So that becomes the plot of the musical.
The commune is passé.
What?
Think about it, people. Just think about it.
Passé?
Where will I go? Who will I be?
Zonker and Mike argue throughout Act 1 of the musical about whether or not they should move out of Walden Commune or not. Ultimately, Mike does decide to move away, hopefully with JJ, but Zonker decides to stay on indefinitely. However, when Zonker decides to renew for another year, he calls the landlord only to discover that Walden Commune has been purchased by an outside party, and they cannot renew. The plot for the second act then becomes what will happen to Zonker when he inevitably has to graduate. And what client has purchased Walden Commune? Well, it turns out that Uncle Duke was released from his arrest on the condition that he establish and run a drug rehabilitation center. So he buys Walden Commune, planning to turn it into a drug rehabilitation center, meaning that he's going to build condos there. That's the end of Act 1. Act 2 is pretty much what you'd expect with that setup. The main characters mope about, but eventually come to terms with leaving Walden. BD gets transferred from the Dallas Cowboys to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which makes it easier for Boopsy to follow him. Mike manages to propose to JJ, although by accident. Mark's listeners manage to get him another radio job. Zonker actually graduates, and Joni and JJ begin the difficult process of making up. It's interesting that Trudeau decided to end the musical with Joni and JJ on the path to reconciliation, considering that in the later 80s and into the 90s, they would eventually become estranged, and as of the current comic, they'd no longer talk to each other. But still, this brief moment of togetherness where they are on the path towards liking each other is important to put their breakup in context. Another interesting breakup to put into context is JJ and Mike himself, because those two eventually do get married and then eventually get divorced. There are some tender moments in the musical, such as Boopsy and Honey having a duet about how they deal with their respective men.
I do not make assumptions, I worship him from afar. And though he seems to look through me, I have his full fidelity. It's just that he was born to be a complicated man.
And there's also a cute, soft-shoe number between Roland and BD, espousing the Reaganite message about how awesome wealth is.
The right time to take pains, not to pay on capital gains. The guy who loads the dice on his broker's advice, he's where the buck should stop the lonely guy at the top, the right.
And in the end, despite Zonker's protestations to the contrary, they do all graduate. Also, Duke drives a bulldozer through the side of Walden Commune.
Hit Broadway like a...
That is very quick and choppy footage of it because that is the only footage I can find of it. But yes, the actual canonical ending of Doonesbury's Walden Commune is that Uncle Duke drives a bulldozer through the side of it near the end of this musical. How did this not win all of the Tonys? So that's basically the plot and the overview of what this musical was. Now let's talk about the actual Broadway production of it. Director Jacques Levy brought in an interesting Brechtian concept for the musical. He wanted everyone to be visible all the time, even in scenes where they weren't present. This didn't really add anything to the narrative of the musical, but it didn't really subtract anything either. It was sort of a net neutral. What it did do was give a greater ensemble feel, which was important to the musical that only had 10 characters. The design of the set drew heavily from Trudeau's illustrations, preferring to replicate the drawing style on flat stock pieces rather than building realistic structures around the live actors. Even the final scene, where the students picked up their diplomas, features cutouts of hand-drawn audience members in the background. You can see them in these clips. The end result is a little bit awkward, in my view. It sort of reminds the audience that these characters are not the ones that are hand-drawn, that there is a distinction between the comic and what you're watching, rather than letting the audience get lost in the world. Compare something like Charlie Brown. If you put the Charlie Brown actor next to a real drawing of the character, it creates a disassociative feeling that keeps you from buying into it. Then again, as far as scenic design goes, Peanuts is more stylized than Doonesbury is, so putting a real actor next to a drawn-looking set piece might create a better comic tone for something like Peanuts than it does for Doonesbury, which is more grounded in reality. The score from Elizabeth Swados has a couple of gems in it, and the songs do some marginal work in helping to move the story forward and dig into character, rather than simply interrupting for musical numbers, although there are a couple of those.
Just what you paid and what it goes for nowadays. By Allah!
One of the criticisms that Swados received throughout her career, both at La Mama and on Broadway, was that her songs didn't have hummable melodies to them, and that's certainly true here. These songs have very interesting repetitive structures. Sondheim was the same way in getting criticized for not having melodies, but honestly, I think the person who has the most blame for the score feeling kind of choppy is not Swados' music, but Trudeau's lyrics. As mentioned before, Swados was very willing to put whatever subject matter to music that was necessary for the story, but Trudeau is not a trained lyricist, and there's definitely some times you can feel him straining to put lyrics to the music that Swados had come up with. I have no confirmation for this, but listening to the score, I am almost certain that the music came first. Trudeau's lyrics, like Trudeau's prose in both the musical and in the original comic, is densely packed. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of very high-scoring Scrabble words in this script.
Another memorable meal. Top chow with zero taste appeal.
It's much too weird to be real.
Fast food, only for the brave. To go, or maybe it's too late.
But then again, that makes it somewhat difficult to set to music. Compare something like West Side Story, where we actively know that the score did come before the lyrics did. Sondheim, I think, manages in West Side Story to write alongside Burnside's score. He runs at the same pace. Sondheim can tell how the score sounds and can make the lyricism of the lyrics match that.
We said okay, no rumpus, no tricks, but just in case they jump us, we're ready to mix tonight. We're gonna rock it tonight, we're gonna jazz it up and have us a ball.
Trudeau, by comparison, I feel is better suited to Swados when she's writing slower, more contemplative songs. The song Just One Night, I think, is perfectly functional.
Just one night. I have so many other nights ahead of me.
But when you get into something like Another Memorable Meal, the lyrics can feel very choppy.
One more Michael masterpiece. Trace your initials in the grease.
The other thing about Swados' score is that it's not specifically orchestral or sweeping. It is very much phrases put together to music, which is perfectly fine if Trudeau is able to make the lyrics match that kind of broken up tone. But it doesn't always work, and sometimes the pauses feel like they are straining for a reason why they're there. The opening number is a very good example of this contrast. Swados wrote a score that is very driving, with big pauses in between the different musical phrases, but Trudeau wrote one long lyrical phrase that runs over all of it, so you end up with a phrase that is chopped into fourths for seemingly no reason.
Graduation will probably stand the test of time, and it's almost at hand.
There's also a rap in this show that is a rap.
Got the slave, his junkie rich baritone, the rants and the chants on the calling phone, his political savvy, his incredible wit, so pick up the phone.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about this one. But as I said, there are some songs on the score that are really good, even some that aren't particularly languid. Boopsy's solo, I Can Have It All, is a rather funny feminist power ballad about following your boyfriend to his job.
I'm gonna have it all, and career, I'm gonna have it by this time next year. Don't you know that my dream just won't quit? And you know that I'm gonna go get it, gonna go get it now, gonna go get it, gonna go get it.
I would say if you're looking for any cabaret songs in this musical, this is the one you're gonna pick.
Go get it, gotta go get it.
And when we discuss how songs in musicals should always help rather than hinder character growth, I don't think there's a better example of that in this musical than the song Mother, which is basically where Joni and JJ begin their process of reconciling each other. At the beginning of the song, they are totally apart, but by the end, they have just begun to start it. And that's evident in the lyrics.
I just feel what I'd feel if I had you again. There were times when I felt that the pain wouldn't end, and how hard it was to love you when I never had you near. How strange to be your friend now that I do.
So on the whole, the score of Doonesbury is hit and miss, but I think that matches a book that's also kind of hit and miss, so bravo there. But in all honesty, you've heard throughout this video how much I've been citing the original comic with comparison to the musical, and that's probably the turning point of this show. You kind of need to know the comic to understand what's going on. As mentioned, many of the character motivations and plot threads have roots in the comic, and individual scenes include callbacks to jokes from the comic. Another memorable meal is basically an extended joke about Mike's terrible cooking, which is a joke that shows up in the animated special.
Mike, I gotta ask you, is this stuff benign?
Well, of course it is. What kind
Does it have a name, Mike? Does the meal in front of us have a name?
The song Complicated Man is another example of this. On its surface, it's a very tender power ballad about how the women singing it are forgiving their men for doing terrible things, which might not seem like the best sentiment, but if you know the context, it's at least marginally better. The nature of Boopsy and BD's relationship, as well as Honey and Duke's relationship, gains a lot from the 12 years of context in the play leading up to that. These are presented as given circumstances in the musical, whereas in the comic, we actually see both couples meet, and we do see instances in both cases where the women are pushing back against the men. There is a limit.
But it would have been worth it, lasting peace-wise, if it hadn't been for that damn prairie populist with his...
Mr. McGovern, BD, he and Tenant Shriver were decent men. Gosh, if they hadn't pricked our national conscience...
We would have won!
Boopsy in particular has gained more edge as the comic has gone on past this musical, but that doesn't exist in this version. Then there's comments from BD that just are comments from BD.
Doonesbury, if people like me hadn't gone, it would have been Domino City for the
Do you hear that? Do you hear that?
BD has always served as the strip's resident conservative voice in a bubble that is largely pretty liberal, but even in recent years, Trudeau has started to walk back some of the things that BD said in the first decade of the comic. Compare something like the dick boyfriend in Waitress, who says worse things but at least has some payoff at the end. Such does not happen for BD in this musical. Some comments BD makes in particular about Joni breastfeeding have not aged particularly well. The character of Zonker feels a little bit out of place in this musical without the proper context. His motivation is built on resistance to changes in the status quo, a status quo that, without the comment to back it up, seems somewhat random. Talking to plants, swimming in a puddle. These are things that, like the relationships before, were built up in the comic, but when presented without any proper context, they don't seem to be founded on anything. Compare something like Snoopy's World War I flying ace in Charlie Brown. Even with the context, it's a relatively random addition to the musical, serving no real plot. The two differences being that, first of all, Charlie Brown itself really has no plot, so any additions to the revue-style musical don't really hinder anything. And secondly, Doonesbury is going for a more realistic portrayal of its characters, so adding the surrealism from the comic without the context that it is supposed to be surrealism makes it very confused when it's on stage. And even with that, the talking plants that accompanied Zonker as a backing chorus in this musical were a one-off joke in the comics, so including them as a Audrey 2 style group of puppets is a choice. Not to mention, everything having to do with Ronald Reagan in those transitions has nothing to do with the plot at large, which leads to the larger point. Doonesbury the musical is not as political as Doonesbury the comic, which makes it an odd sell to fans of Doonesbury the comic. The counterpoint to this is that Doonesbury was, of course, never straight political satire. Like I said, it's about how the personal invades the political and vice versa. At the center of nearly every Doonesbury strip, the conflict is external rather than internal. This is one of the reasons that the characters were able to exist as stock tropes for so long. Their interactions with the world were analogous to an entire subset of Americans, and personal issues generally stayed off the pages except when they were motivated by political movements. And yet, the musical of Doonesbury is tackling a plot development that has little to do with politics anyway, the graduation from college. If you're going to move on to a moving timeline, then that's just something that has to naturally happen. It isn't affected by the world around them. Thus, I think it makes sense, in a musical about a non-political action, to focus on the personal lives of the characters. So why did Trudeau even put all the Ronald Reagan sketches in the first place? Who really knows? Maybe he felt pressure to keep up appearances. It is worth noting that he used all that material again later, but I'm going to get to that. It's also important to point out that this political over the personal style of Doonesbury changed after this musical. The political strips are more common, obviously, but major plot developments often necessitated the kind of detours into personal anecdote that the first 12 years used very sparingly. As more characters got added, we needed to deal with more personal conflicts that were driven by time rather than by politics, and so diversions like this musical have become more common, albeit in the comic strip form. So, in short, Doonesbury, I think, served the purpose it needed to in 1983. It was created to move the strip from a fixed to a moving timeline, and it does so, generally keeping up the appearance of the comic strip without really getting anything wrong. But does that mean it needs to keep being produced?
If you were in New York in 1983 and wandered into the Biltmore Theater with no context for the musical you were about to see, you'd have seen a generally enjoyable story about kids graduating from college and facing their anxieties about the world they'd be entering into.
In 2018, watching Doonesbury, even with the context, it's a hard but not impossible sell. If you watched Doonesbury the musical now, believing it to be a modern musical commenting on current Doonesbury, it would make no sense. The comic has been running for 48 years now, and the characters are fundamentally different people. In fact, on March 9th, 2020, Doonesbury will pass Peanuts for the longest runtime of a comic strip by a single author, although because of the hiatus and recent delays, it means that the strip count is still lower. And in a recent comic, Trudeau actually mentioned this. Mark has grown up from a radio DJ into an NPR reporter, and there's a recent comic where he's interviewing a young revolutionary, only for that revolutionary, in the eyes of the comic, to become the younger Mark, with a very clear distinction between the two. Which I think also kind of is the difference between modern and old Doonesbury. And one of the reasons that the musical, which is stuck in the middle of those two, would need an appropriate context to be performed today. Not to mention, if people like Doonesbury because of its most recent iterations, the characters that are from the last 30 years don't appear. If you were to make a Doonesbury musical today, I don't even know where you'd start including characters. There's so many people to be put in. Then again, I think this musical contains something truthful about what it is like as a college student to graduate into a tumultuous political climate. The Reagan years are obviously different from anything we're living through right now, but that fear of moving from a status quo into an uncertain future, I think, is genuine. And one of the reasons that Trudeau wanted to move the characters into the real time anyway. So I think with the proper context, a contemporary production of Doonesbury is possible, in the way that there are prequels for films that come out years after the originals. While the show is obviously licensed, productions of it have been sparse since 1983. No major regional theaters picked up on it, and there was no national tour.
A 2012 edition of the popular New York cabaret If It Only Even Runs a Minute featured songs from Doonesbury.
In 2015, 54 Below staged a concert reading of the musical, and actually 54 Below is on my radar right now because currently the only upcoming production of Doonesbury listed on Samuel French's website is a one-night-only performance at Studio 54 on February 15th of 2020. I don't know what this means, but Studio 54, if you're planning something for the 50th anniversary of Doonesbury, call me. Honestly, of the 6 musicals I'm discussing in the series, I think this is one of the 2 best candidates for City Center encores. It's got 2 notable names behind the wheel, a relatively respected history, and an opportunity to provide context for what it did for the comic and what it did for Broadway. Sort of like what I'm doing here. But the final question I have to ask is one that I said at the very beginning, and I don't think I've really found an answer to yet, which is, why is it a musical? It wasn't Trudeau and Swados' only contribution. As I mentioned, they decided to reuse the Ronald Reagan stuff the following year when they created an off-Broadway musical called Rap Master Ronnie.
He be trying to make the big box beat. Trying to get those voters on their feet. Get their consent. All I need is 10%. Say we want the guys pure sex.
Which was basically the Reagan sketches on their own as a way of satirizing Reagan before his re-election campaign. But in light of the 1977 short film, in which was seen by plenty of people and which won all the accolades, it's interesting to me that Trudeau chose to make one of the most important and significant shifts in the history of Doonesbury with a form of art that was limited to one location. In order to see the history of Doonesbury, you had to go to New York and buy a ticket to this musical, and because of its short run, you only had a 4-month window to do so. Obviously, I would never be one to criticize musical theater and say that it doesn't have a cultural impact, but it is notable that Trudeau chose to use a medium that didn't have a lot of mass market appeal to continue his storyline. Not everyone who read Doonesbury in the 1970s and 80s knew that this musical was happening, and not everyone who read Doonesbury when it came back in 1984 knew that the musical had happened, thus giving no context for why Doonesbury was now no longer on a set time frame. But then again, there is one thing that musical theater has over film or television that I think gives Doonesbury the musical an interesting edge in the way that it interacts with history, and that is its reproducibility. By creating a script that can be produced in any time, but which still featured the old Doonesbury characters, Trudeau and Swados managed to take a comic strip that was about to launch off and become a totally different, real-time moving political satire machine, and solidified one little element of it that felt truthful and worth preserving, so future productions of the musical could still explore what it was like to be a college student at this tumultuous time, because Trudeau no longer wanted to. By doing a musical rather than a film, it could be seen as Trudeau kind of giving that scenario over to the public. The public now has the opportunity to live in the world that Trudeau abandoned, a perpetual setting of college, with the kids about to graduate. I don't know what the future of this musical is, but I think that there's something to continue to explore in it. As the musical itself says in the opening number, whether or not this outlook survives, time will tell what we do with our lives. And looking at the nearly 50-year history of Doonesbury, I think it has.
Hey, what's the matter with you?
He was serious, you know.
About the condominiums? Oh, come on.
No, just about the passage of an era.
Well, yeah. I mean, events and stuff, they're different. But not our concerns, our priorities. You know, the things worth fighting for.
When was the last time we fought for anything? I mean, when we started out, we had an energy.